In this video, I'm going to talk about what's called the cash market, or sometimes called the short-term money market, sometimes called the overnight cash market, and how the Reserve Bank of Australia influences this market. This market has let's say, a demand for cash. Now, this is the demand for cash, sometimes called liquidity, by banks on a daily basis. It's not the demand for money in the economy as a whole. And then there's the supply of cash, and this is also by banks to the market. It's not the supply of money in the economy as a whole. It's the amount of liquidity or cash available in the short-term daily money market. The players in this market are exclusively banks and the Reserve Bank of Australia. The supply of cash is really the aggregate of the surpluses in private banks' exchange settlement accounts that they hold with the Reserve Bank of Australia. Now, the surpluses that are held can be influenced by the Reserve Bank of Australia using open market operations, or OMOs. And in the standard textbook story, that involves the buying or selling of bonds to banks. Now, in the textbook story, it's simply the interaction of the demand for cash and the supply of cash that determines the equilibrium cash rate. And in the usual textbook story, we would say that the Reserve Bank of Australia can increase the supply of cash, increase the amount of liquidity in the market by purchasing government bonds from banks, thereby increasing supply and lowering the equilibrium cash rate. Or it can decrease the amount of liquidity in the market by selling bonds to the private banks. The private banks relinquish liquidity in exchange, and therefore the supply of cash, the supply curve, shifts to the left and the actual cash rate rises. Now, that story is fine as far as it goes, but it's an incomplete picture of what really happens. Here's what really occurs. First, the Reserve Bank of Australia will make an announcement about what it wants the cash rate to be, which they call the target cash rate. Now, the Reserve Bank doesn't somehow set that target cash rate. It does not do that. It simply makes an announcement about what it wants it to be. Now, each day there'll be some banks that have shortfalls in their exchange settlement accounts. So at the end of the day, they don't have enough money in their accounts that they hold with the Reserve Bank, in which case they'll need to borrow money in order to make up that shortfall. What the Reserve Bank does is that it offers a lending rate to the private banks to cover their shortfalls in their exchange settlements accounts. And that interest rate that the Reserve Bank offers to the private banks is 0.25% higher than their announced or preferred target rate. Now, there's also going to be some banks which have surpluses in their exchange settlement accounts, and the Reserve Bank will offer a deposit rate to those banks on those surpluses in their exchange settlements accounts, and that deposit rate that they'll offer will be 0.25% lower than their preferred or announced target rate. So we call this difference between the lending rate offered by the Reserve Bank and the deposit rate offered by the Reserve Bank to the private banks the cash rate corridor. Transactions are going to occur within that corridor because no bank is going to borrow money at a rate higher than what the Reserve Bank is offering, and equally no bank is going to want to make deposits in some other bank somewhere at a rate that's lower than what the Reserve Bank is offering. Now that means that we have an operative demand curve that falls within the corridor. The rest of that demand curve is effectively a notional one. It becomes irrelevant. Now, the banks that have a shortfall in their exchange settlements accounts could pay the interest rate offered by the Reserve Bank of Australia. But what they would prefer to do is borrow from other banks at a lower interest rate than that. And equally, the banks that have surpluses could deposit them with the Reserve Bank of Australia, but rather they would like to deposit those excess surpluses with other banks at a higher interest rate. So what this means is that there is a tendency for higgling and haggling between the banks within this cash rate corridor. Now, to ensure the cash rate being the rate which actually occurs, the Reserve Bank will seek to manipulate the amount of liquidity available in the marketplace to try and ensure that the demand for liquidity equals the supply of liquidity at the target cash rate. And it does this by using the open market operations. However, we should note that the supply of cash, liquidity in the market, can be changed by other factors besides the Reserve Bank of Australia. For example, the government, the federal government, could inject more liquidity into the banking system. And it might do that, for example, by increasing unemployment benefits that are paid out. That would increase the amount of liquidity in the banking system. Now, if there were an increase in economic activity such that the demand for money increased, ceteris paribus, assuming nothing else happened, what would happen to the equilibrium cash rate and then interest rates throughout the economy? Okay, so here we are. What if there were an increase in demand for cash, an increase in the demand for liquidity by the banks? Well, assuming that the Reserve Bank did nothing, then the actual cash rate will rise above the target cash rate. If the Reserve Bank did not want the cash rate to change, it wanted the actual cash rate to stay at the target cash rate, what would it have to do? Well, it would have to provide sufficient liquidity in the market to meet demand at the target cash rate. So let's say demand for liquidity increases for some reason. If necessary, the Reserve Bank will respond by either borrowing bonds from the banks, it's called repos, or repurchase agreements, or by buying bonds from the banks. Both of these will increase the supply of liquidity in the market, and it will try to make sure that the increase in the supply of liquidity is just sufficient that the equilibrium actual cash rate will be at the target cash rate. What if the Reserve Bank of Australia wants to change the cash rate? What would happen to the cash market? So here we are in equilibrium. The Reserve Bank, let's say, wants to decrease the cash rate by 0.25%. Well, it simply changes the corridor. It makes its announcement about what the new cash rate will be, and then it changes the interest rate that it offers to the private banks for loans and the interest rate it offers to private banks for deposits. So you get this shift downwards like this. Note that the demand curve itself is not changing. Okay? We're simply moving along it. But in order to ensure that the actual cash rate meets the target, the Reserve Bank will have to ensure that there's sufficient liquidity in the market to achieve that goal. So it increases the supply of cash through either buying bonds from the banks, which is actually fairly rare, or by the repo agreements, that is, by borrowing the bonds from the private banks for a specified period of time, and then returning them at a later date. Once this lower cash rate has been achieved, then, all other things remaining equal, the private banks will be able to afford to charge lower interest rates on each of its different kinds of products. With a lower cash rate, the interest rates on mortgages, on personal loans, on investment loans, and on credit cards will be passed on throughout the economy. This lower interest rate will tend, it's hoped, to encourage borrowing for the purposes of either consumption expenditure or, more importantly, for investment expenditure by both households and businesses.